Today's talk is, as the slide indicates, is a quick overview of PCI with the long lead time that Nick said, because they put out all the docs on Thursday. But this is a long time in the making. They've been working on this for a couple of years. And those of you who have been involved in it before know that they've gone out for requests for comment and multiple times, and there have been a lot of back and forth before this was finally released. So this is not going to be, we're not going to go down every control and talk about every change that's made, but it is kind of a high level overview of some of the biggest changes, not only from what was changed in the controls and the responsibilities, but also some of the things that from an assessment standpoint that assessors have to worry about as well. Kind of pulls back the curtain a little bit on what your QSAs are doing for you and how we need to do it. So if you are an entity that needs to be PCI compliant, you're going to learn a little bit about the changes made to not only your responsibilities, but ours as well. So thank you for joining us, and we'll get underway. So the first slide is just a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit about Compass, and who better to tell about Compass than one of our managing partners, Jerry Hughes. Jerry, you want to just...
Yeah, thanks, Derek, and folks, thanks for joining us today. Yeah, Compass was founded in 2010. It's a nationwide leader in providing IT security, compliance, and risk management services to all organizations of various sizes in all industries as well. Our mission back in 2010 was what it is today, and that is to partner with our organizations that we work with, right? So we have clients, but we deal with them as partners because we have proven over time that these relationships are more than just a one and done event. Much like the PCI work that we're going to talk about today, it's a recurring requirement. It's ongoing. Our relationship with our clients is quite similar.
All right, thanks, Jerry. So here's a quick agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the PCI timeline and when it starts, which is now, and when the requirements kick in. We're going to talk about the overview of changes from PCI 3.2.1, the different types of changes. Next bullet, in place and all the many exceptions. Those of you who have gone through PCI assessments before, if something is in place, that means the control is working right. And they've actually added categories about how they can be kind of working right and not working right entirely, or did we fix it? We'll talk a little bit about the difference between if a control isn't applicable versus, we're not going to test it at all. A new thing that I shouldn't say new. They've kind of formalized a full versus a partial assessment, even in terms of a ROC. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll go over the customized versus defined approach. And we'll talk about some of the biggest changes in terms of the actual controls enhancements that have gone through. Or been gone through. So several of these slides you see are pulled directly from PCI documents themselves, because there's no reason to recreate the wheel. So the first one is a timeline for implementation. As Nick had said earlier, that the end of March is when the official release came through. So as of Thursday, we got documents on a ROC template and the attestation of compliance template, PCI controls 4.0, and a summary of changes doc as well. Those all got dropped into the PCI channel. They're available. They are for the general public. Anybody can download them, take a look at them, and go through them. One of the couple of things to point out on this slide, PCI DSS 3.2.1, which is what is everybody's requirement currently, is not going away. It's not going away until March of 2024, which is really 2 years from today. So as long if this is something that you're comfortable with, that you want to continue to use, that's great. You have plenty of time. I'd be willing to say even that over the next several months, if your assessment is going to start, you're going to probably be using the 3.2.1. PCI 4.0, as with many of the major releases, there are some requirements that are live the first time you use it, And there are many requirements that are called future dated requirements, which means they're best practice until they kick in as a requirement. And PCI DSS has set this requirement date as of the end of March 2025. So there's really 3 years from today that we have until these new requirements for PCI, they say become effective, but I'm going to say become mandatory, because you really should be working towards these going forward. One more bullet again to note on this is Q2 of 2022, and you see the little box talks about ISA and QSA training and supporting documents. The reason this is important is because for PCI 4.0, it's enough of a new setup and changes to both the reporting structure and the controls. They're going to do supplemental training for the existing QSAs as well as any new QSAs that come on. They have not completed that training program yet, so it hasn't been rolled out, and they're targeting, I'm going to say, the end of Q2, since it just started the beginning of Q2 right now. And it should, and please take note that assessors, QSAs cannot do 4.0 reports on compliance or attestations until they have been trained. So we expect that to happen probably late June, early July fashion. Up until then, the documents are available for view and review and discussion and debate, but the actual rocks cannot be used, 4.0 can't be used unless the QSA has been trained in 4.0.
Yeah, and one other note too, Derek and folks, what we're going to do, Compass is taking the approach like we always have when big releases come out, as we get with our clients, we walk through the changes in a little bit more detail as it pertains to their particular environments. But don't wait, because there's a time at 2 years out where, you know, it's available to start, but, you know, begin preparing now, right? So begin moving to implement some of these controls that may be new, or the changes to some of the controls that were there that have been modified. You need to start to work toward being compliant in that fashion. So don't wait till time is at your back and then you're racing against time.
Great point. So this next slide, very simple. As you read through the docs, PCI has split up the changes into 3 main areas. And this is very similar to prior releases. And this is here just for explanation and edification. They have what they call evolving requirements, and those are changes, and new requirements are, they consider that an evolving. If you have to look at the change documents, a new requirement is set up under the evolving requirement. There's clarification or guidance. And this is where they found items that probably needed some more explanation or had a lot of questions when people were going through PCI assessments. The best one, as I was reading through this, there were multiple places where they talked about passwords and 90-day expirations. And although we'll get into that actually a little bit in a future slide, the clarification or guidance that they pointed out over and over again in this version was that if you have a user who is logging in to take a credit card one at a time, say at a convenience store or a supermarket or anything else like that, that does not have to adhere to that 90-day, because in a lot of cases, POS logins are a simple user ID, like a 4-digit ID, and to get you into the system. And there was a lot of misunderstanding around that password stuff. So that's what they consider clarification or guidance. And then the last one is just structure or format. You'll see a lot of this in this release. I noticed that they combined controls, they split out controls. So if you see something flagged as a structure or format change, that's exactly what it is. They haven't changed the control itself, but they may have moved it around. They may have renumbered it, things like that. So as you're going through the change docs, just keep that in mind about the types of changes that came up with this.
Yeah, and I think they did a great job with the updates too. You know, a lot of these, if you've worked with the PCI data security standard in the past, I think you'll agree a lot of the requirements aren't always clearly articulated, and it leads to some confusion and things like that. And I think they've done a good job to clarify vague areas like that. And like Derek said, they're combining things too. So it was a good improvement, I believe, over 3.2.1.
But the question everybody asks, well, how many new things do I have to worry about? There's 68 new requirements in total. And just like the last versions, they split them off. There are 53 that are applicable to everybody. And there are 11 that are only applicable to what are called service providers. Just a quick explanation, if you have a gas station and you're taking credit cards, you're what's called a merchant. If you're a cloud provider who is helping the merchant by storing data or providing AWS or anything else like that, or IT services, you're a service provider. So they make some PCI controls that are only applicable to service providers. Most of them are applicable to the merchant. They also split them off. You saw in the earlier slide about future dated controls versus effective instantly. And of those, there are 13 that are required basically once you start using 4.0, and 51 are considered a best practice until 2025. Now, bear in mind, a lot of these controls are, when they can be dated as future, but those 13 that are required on day one, most of them are going to be a similar type of control that I will go over later in the process. One thing I do want to really call out is this link down at the bottom. This is the link to the document library where you can find all these different documents, not only on 4.0, but on 3.1 and everything else like this. This is a public site. You don't have to be a QSA to find these documents. But these are where you come up with the changes to the controls between the two. If you want to look at the guidance, if you want to look at what the reports are going to look like, this is where you can download them all. So here's what one of these docs looks like. This is a page from the guidance document, and this is a control example of one of the controls in PCI ROC, a report on compliance rather. It's similar to what 3.2.1 looked at like, but they've added some areas, and you'll find this is really it's an expansion of a lot of things that were already in 3.2.1. So I'm not going to read off everything in here. There are a couple of main areas that I want to point out. They've split, and we'll talk about this later again. They've split all the controls up into what's called the defined approach, which is what we've been doing since the beginning of time. It's 3.2.1. It tells you what the control is and what you need to adhere to. And then what's called the customized approach, which is there was a lot of pushback about people not being able to meet the control exactly, or can we go beyond the control? And I always use the example of, people had antivirus in, and you had to have an antivirus control. Well, we've gone way beyond that. We've gone into anti-malware and whitelisting and everything else like that, going beyond the control, where you may not have something called an antivirus anymore, but you have DLP software and whitelisting and all sorts of things like that. So think of the defined approach as the letter of the law, and the customized approach almost as the spirit of the law. It has a section on who's, the applicability is how it applies, who it applies to, and if it's a future requirement or not. This is one that is a future requirement in there, so it actually tells you when it's available. It'll give you testing procedures. So when your QSA comes in and starts talking to you, this is the kind of stuff that we're looking at. When it comes down to that, we examine configurations, we look at processes. So this gives the QSA guidance, but it can also help anybody who has to go through a ROC as to, oh, this is what they're going to be looking for, set this up. And then they give you a little bit of general guidance. They've added some things like good practices, examples of things that can meet the control. In some cases, they'll give you examples. If I noticed this one, and again, this is pulled right from the PCI sample docs. Their example is blank in this one, so they don't always have an example of what meets the control. And then a little bit of further information. There is a wealth of information here. They do every single control like this. So if you ever want more information on it, this is the place to go. Or you ask your trusty QSA, and this is where we go to kind of, we talk to each other and we go back and forth with this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I think the guidance was one of the areas that they did a real nice job with. That'll certainly assist you folks that are maybe first time folks working your way through the data security standard. The other thing about one note about the customized approach, also compared to the defined approach, if you look at those, I mean, it gives us the opportunity and you the opportunity to demonstrate the controls that are in place, you know, in a customized fashion. Whereas in the past, we were forced, if you didn't meet the letter, we're talking about filling out a compensating control worksheet and a lot of other dancing just to meet the requirement. And this gives us a little bit more flexibility. So it is a very positive thing the way they did this, and I definitely especially like that aspect.
And we'll talk, and we have some slides coming up that'll talk about that. So one of the things I mentioned in the earlier was when you meet a control, just like any other risk assessment, you consider the control in place, which is terrific. It doesn't matter if it's NIST, doesn't matter if it's HIPAA, doesn't matter if it's ISO, doesn't matter if it's PCI. You have a control in place. PCI, however, there are multiple other ways to answer that question. And a couple of these have been expanded and new, but they're usually the ones you see most are in place or not applicable. And there's been some, some back and forth between not applicable and not tested. So we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. Not in place. Well, you don't use that as much with a ROC, because if it's not in place, you fail the report on compliance. Until it's in place, it's a failure in there. So you never want to see that. And then a new one, which we'll talk a little bit about in 2 slides from now, is in place with remediation. Now this is a new one, so I have some examples of that going forward. You guys, I won't read you the slide. You can, you can get a copy of the slides and kind of go through it. But this is also pulled right from the PCI docs to be able to go through. So we'll take a look at these right now, and without further ado, we'll take a look at the difference between not applicable and not tested. So not applicable really means that we took a look at the control, but it's not applicable to your environment. The really clear examples are if you're using point-to-point encryption devices in your organization and you want to go through this. Well, that means there are certain controls that have been looked at or looked at for you and found not to be applicable to the environment. A very common one is if your environment does not store any cardholder data in the environment. There are certain sections of Section 3 and databases and everything where you have to validate things. Well, if there's no cardholder data, there's nothing to nothing to take a look at. So as a QSA, we've taken a look and we've marked that as not applicable. Not tested is a little bit different. Not tested means that we didn't even look at the control at all. So and not tested, and we'll bring this up a little bit in a couple more slides, but these examples are pretty good. I always think of Iron Mountain. And in the old days, coming from the old banks and credit unions, we used to store financial docs over at Iron Mountain for a certain period of time as a secure area. So that's old school. And if you use something like that, and Iron Mountain wanted a ROC, but they have nothing to do with PCI except for the fact that they were storing stuff in, you could just take a look at requirement 9 and mark everything else off as not tested. Now that, and this is a new thing right now, you can go with what's called a partial assessment in a ROC. So you can actually come down and say, we didn't look at every control in this ROC because we didn't need to. And where this is really doing, this is really going to help out is for MSPs and service providers and things like that. And we'll talk a little bit about that going forward, but think to yourself, if I'm doing infrastructure as a service, I'm not worried about, access controls for the user or anything else like that, but my clientele still wants me to be PCI compliant because they're asking them to be PCI compliant. So keep in mind here that not tested means we didn't even look at the control. Not applicable really means it doesn't apply to your environment. And then the other control I wanted to touch on was in place with remediation. Now, Jerry and I come into this all the time, especially with new ROCs and new reports on compliance that we're coming in for the first time. They're going for their PCI certification, and even with the self-assessment questionnaires. one of the most basic requirements is that you should have quarterly vulnerability scans done in your environment. Well, if you've just started the process or just bought a vulnerability scanner, you may only have one available. And if it's your first rock, that's okay. But we'll come in and take a look and we'll see a rock from a previous year. And let's say the IT person left the organization who was running the scans and you didn't run a scan, excuse me, or you didn't perform a pen test. Well, we'll find that out relatively early in the process. And that doesn't mean PCI kind of took a step forward and said, okay, well, what we're seeing out here is you weren't in compliance when your QSA stepped through the door, but you actually remediated while he was doing the assessment. And so rather than just marking it yes, now we have the ability to mark something in place with remediation, which means you've corrected the issue. The QSA is confident the issue was addressed, the control is in place, and this is an important thing, and that there's a process in place to keep it moving forward. So in the example of a quarterly vulnerability scan or a firewall configuration, we wouldn't only be looking for the fact that the scan was conducted, but did you put a policy or a process in place to ensure that the scan will keep going on, or you'll keep checking the configuration. This is a slightly new, this is new, but this is, those of us who go in the environment and take a look at rocks, we always say, well, if you fail one area, does that mean the rock, you can't issue the rock until a year if you miss a vulnerability scan? Well, no, that's not practical. So this is basically the council saying, okay, this is how you issue a rock that's acceptable to everybody. You have a control now that you mark that was in place with remediation.
Yeah, and this is where the process works, right? So the council, when they do the updates, like in this case, from 3.2.1 to 4.0, they take feedback from us, the QSAs that are doing the work in the field continuously. And this is an area that, like Derek had mentioned, we encounter this all the time. So this is a really, really good enhancement. It's a common sense thing. As you probably know, Compass does a lot of IT audit work in all industries. And this is what we do. We apply auditor judgment. We move through, like Derek said in his example of scanning, we would make sure that they had the subsequent licensing to continue the quarterly scans in his example, and make sure that they've got that, like he said, a policy or process to continue doing those scans. And now we have a comfort level that they are going to, and the issue has been remediated, they're going to be doing them going forward. So it's a great enhancement.
And the other day, and we touched on this at the earlier slide, I wanted to bring out again a little bit about the difference between a full assessment and partial assessment. This is a new, it's not really new. You could always mark controls as not tested or not assessed, but in a lot of cases, the council was always frowning on us using not tested in the environment. They really wanted to see either not applicable because we went through the control, or in place to get the full rock. And now it's more of an advertisement that says, listen, we understand that there are a lot of cloud providers, there are a lot of infrastructure, there are a lot of third parties that can't possibly adhere to all 12 requirements because they don't deal with more than 2 or 3 of them in their entire organization. So from this, we can, and this is all about defining scope, and we talk about this in going forward, is if you define the scope of the organization as only having, only supporting infrastructure, for example, you could do just the infrastructure controls, and that would be called out as part of the process. This way you could still get a rock that you can give out to clients and everybody else like that, and it shows that only certain controls have been assessed. The reason I really like this is those clients that have worked with me in the past, we always talk about things called responsibility matrices for third parties, where the third party is responsible for these controls, you're responsible for these controls, and then some of us are responsible for both sides of controls. Using that responsibility matrix, an MSP could put forth a rock only for the controls that they say they're going to be responsible for. We can get that rock and that attestation of compliance. I can see right away which one, anything else they didn't test. So I'm going to go back to the client and say, okay, you've got a rock that says I'm responsible for infrastructure only, which means I want to see your controls for everything else. So this is something, hopefully we'll start to see more adoption going forward from MSPs and other third parties, which will allow them to get stuff without having to go through the 200 plus controls on an entire rock.
Right. And like with any audit, it's all about the scope. And as you move forward with this, it's like, it's funny because we used to talk as our QSAs meet internally about some of this, and PCI being the only audit that we do that's particularly is just binary. It is literally pass, fail, you're done. And now with these last couple of slides that you saw, now organizations, especially like MSPs and such, can have the audit performed on a facet of the business that makes sense for what they do.
So Jerry mentioned the customized approach a couple of slides ago. So this is a new way, instead of taking a look at the defined approach that has the control in place. And again, I think of it as meeting the spirit of the control, if not the letter. Now, there's a couple of things to consider here. This is a brand new option on how to assess PCI controls. So there's not a, we haven't done this to this degree before. It is not a compensating control exercise. The compensating controls were meant, they're meant to be used if you can't actually meet the original control for some reason, legal, technical, business. You have to define why you can't meet the control, have alternate controls in place to the degree, and go forward with that every year. The customized approach is a little bit different. The customized approach, and I'll give you what I think is a really good example in the next slide or two. Basically, it allows you to meet that stated objective that doesn't, if you don't, you don't have to be as strict, but it's really meant for innovators in larger organizations that may either go beyond the control or have different ways of being able to use that control. You probably won't see it in a lot of smaller organizations or people that have lower instances of PCI. And the next couple of slides are going to tell you why. And so there are two, so I have two slides and I'll spoil it. This first slide is what the entity, i.e. the people trying to be compliant, have to do to use the customized approach. So each control needs its own risk analysis and risk assessment using a risk template. And each one has to, document and maintain evidence about, what's going on and how we're doing it. And you have to test the control to prove the effectiveness, document the testing to go through. And this is for every single control you want to use the customized approach for. And, so it's not something that says, oh, we're just going to, take this under advisement and we're going to kind of get around this control. You really have to think about this. There's got to be a good reason in the organization why the defined approach doesn't work for this. And then after you guys do all that, the assessors, i.e. Jerry and I, have to go in and take a look at your risk assessment and your control matrix and everything you did. And then we're going to have to derive a way to test that to prove it's acceptable to us and PCI to make that's in place. And, have to go through this process every year and go through that. Now, having said that, there are a couple of controls that I think are really good candidates, and one of them is the bane of everybody's existence, the 90-day password area. And they've already kind of done this, and I'll just give this as a real general example, is that if you guys, if the client said, okay, we're going to use MFA for every system you have to log in everywhere, and it's going to be tokenized and token access and go through that, we're going to demonstrate it, we'll risk assess, and you can steal my password all day long, you're not getting in without this token. That's above and beyond. That's a way to use the customized approach instead of having to set the password for every 90 days. But it's something that, one, you really want to think about, because you're going to have to go control by control. It's nothing that says, okay, we're going to use the customized approach for half the stuff involved, because it's really going to add to the amount of time it takes to not only do the assessment, but for you guys to become compliant. So think about it very, very carefully as we go through. There's nothing to say we can't, but it's something that needs to be carefully thought out. And again, I say this not having gone through PCI 4.0 training by the council, so I fully anticipate several months from now to come out with either more information or better defined information on how that comes out. What you see in front of you right here is a page from the actual PCI ROC. And the reason I wanted to point this out is that it is a little bit different. Actually, it's quite different than what we used to use in the PCI ROC. And this is one very simple control. I picked a control that just says, hey, have you reviewed your security policy once every 12 months? And do you update it as needed to reflect the change to the business or risk environments? Now, first thing is the same. Which one is it? Is it in place? In place with remediation? Not applicable, not tested, not in place. Pick one. And then you have to describe, and this is common to every QSA, we have to describe why we found it to be acceptable. Oh, well, we took a look at the policy. There was a date on the policy. It was signed by the board of directors 3 months ago. And we could actually see that it was signed a year ago and 2 years ago and stuff like that. And we found that was in there. And there were 3 changes made in the past year to the business environment, something akin to that. Now, for every control now, your QSA is also going to have to say whether you use the customized approach, yes or no. I can't possibly think of why you would use the customized approach on a control like this. This is such a straightforward control. And then are you using the defined approach? If you're using the defined approach, are you using a compensating control on top of it? So these are all additional questions that we have to answer as part of the ROC now that were not part of the original ROC. The top half was what we used to do. The bottom half is new. And then the next one, which is the same control, for the reporting instructions where we're filling off our ROC, just for that, it says identify the evidence reference number for the information security policy, identify the interviews conducted for this. So this is a little bit different too, and they've designed the controls around this so that every control now, you not only say why you consider the control in place or not in place or in place with compensating controls. Now, pretty much for every single control, they're asking you to list the list the document you reviewed to make your decision and list the interview, the person you talked to back that up as well. So what they're really doing, and this is a Derek Boczenowski opinion, is there are a lot of QSAs out there that kind of go through the motions in some cases. I shouldn't say a lot. There are some that, and some companies that may not go through the depth that PCI DSS requires or advises you go through. To get this ROC done, you don't have a choice now. You're going to have to really kind of pour through the evidence and tie everything together. There was another QSA I saw that put out on a blog that basically said if you're going to have to end up doing this manually on a regular basis, it could potentially double the amount of time to fill out the ROC.
You know what? One of the good things here, though, if you look at this from an IT auditor's perspective, a career IT auditor like Derek and myself, I mean, this is part of what you would have in your work papers anyway as an auditor, right? I want to identify who I spoke to. I want to link that to the evidence obtained so that it matches with the requirement for the particular control that's being tested. It's just good auditing practice, and all they did was call it out here in this new format, which I love.
That's a really great point. Is the ROC is really becoming the work papers at this point, and the ROC is something that is for the client to keep, to show that diligence has gone through. It's the attestation of compliance that goes out, that you show to everybody, that shows you are compliant right now. So Jerry, that's a great point that you pointed out.
Yeah, and you never hand over the full ROC to anybody asking for that. You're going to provide them only the attestation. There's a lot of confidential. You saw in some of the slides we've given you here, and if you've ever looked at a full ROC, it is extremely confidential. It's got a lot of information about your environment, and it's in the wrong hands, a potential roadmap for a bad actor. So do not hand that over, just the AOC.
Yep. So now we're going to talk about, since we've gone through kind of the audit half of the doc, we're actually going to talk about some of the top changes of the controls that have taken place. And the first one that I pulled out were roles and responsibilities. Now, there were 2 or 3 sections in the old rocks that said, have you assigned, somebody as the ISO? And do you have roles and responsibilities for, 2 or 3 different sections? Well, what they've done is they've taken and they've said, hey, every requirement 1 through 12, and it's, I believe it's 112, 212, 312, 412. I think those are the control numbers. They're going to say, they ask the same question. Have you assigned roles and responsibilities for this PCI requirement? And so really what they're doing is they're asking the client to show accountability, because everybody knows. I couldn't tell you the amount of times we've walked into a client and we said, okay, who's responsible for this? Well, it's HR. Oh, no, it's not. It's operations. Oh, no, it's not. So they want a formal assignment of roles and responsibilities. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't assign it all to one person. And in some cases, it absolutely is. But what it does mean is that you want a document that has defined roles and responsibilities. Those of you with large organizations are familiar with RACI matrices, which stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. You can use a RACI matrix. You can use a job description. You can use a PCI roles and responsibility piece of paper that is, where you just assign 1 through 12.
Yeah, and this is a good one too. One other note too, Derek, on this. With roles and responsibilities, this is basically tying back to your policies. Your policies are the Bible for your business. The do's and don'ts. You define the role, okay, the security officer. And what is the security officer responsible? Oh, he's responsible for, reviewing access controls and whatever. But in your policy, you're going to have those policy statements where there's a clear role and a clear responsibility. And that this is just tying to that. It's not a new leap of faith here.
Right. So the next one, passwords, bane of everybody's existence. Obviously, several years ago, NIST came out with new password requirements where they said, hey, the longer it is, the better they are. And the longer you make them, the more complex you make them, the longer you can, push out the reset period to do that. So PCI kind of straddled the fence a little bit. They did raise the minimum number of digits for passwords from 7 to 12, which is long overdue in my opinion. But they also pushed the number of lockouts attempts from 6 to 10, which means you can actually have more lockouts. I don't know of anybody who really does 10 lockout attempts. Normally they stop at like 3 or 5.
Yeah.
But 10 was 10 gives a little bit more. Now, the 90-day password requirement was kept, but it was kept if it's the only method of authentication, i.e. if you're logging in to the CDE and this is the only requirement to get in there, then you have to have a 90-day password. However, if you're using MFA, if you're using multi-factor and things like that, you can mark this as not applicable. And we'll get into that, as we go down and start using that, they'll give a little bit more guidance on that. But, and as I said at the beginning of the talk, multiple sections were enhanced to state that POS terminals or accounts that only had access to a single card at a time to be able to process things were not required to adhere to the 90 days. This is big because a lot of people get confused about this. And they set all, and I'll use example of a call center or anything else like that, where you're logging in, you don't have access to any databases. All you're doing is you have a screen where you put in one card at a time. You can't call the card up afterwards, anything else like that. You're logging into a Windows environment. The 90-day requirement is not mandated for those accounts. It is required for anybody who's, doing DBA work, has access to back office stuff, any of the ancillary servers, things like that, then it's required. And what goes hand in hand with passwords is MFA. Oh, and I should say, this is also dated, both passwords and this are dated as a future requirement, which means technically it's a best practice until 2025. Whereas the first one we talked about roles and responsibilities was you start using 4.0, that has to be in effect. So for MFA, there's a new requirement that MFA is required for CDE access. And I had to read this about 3 times. I said, well, wait a minute. we always required MFA for CDE access. Well, yes and no. We required MFA for any remote access. We required MFA for any admin access into the CDE. They've expanded it once again, where any access into the any user login into the CDE now requires MFA access. So what this means is that you have and it has to be separate from, say, a remote access VPN with MFA or anything else like that. And what they were discovering is that with everybody working from home and things like that, you could remote in from home, you use the MFA, and then you just jump and piggyback into the CDE and get where you needed to go if you were a user or anything else like that. And even the admins, once they started working from home all the time, it was one MFA. So in theory, what can happen is you can MFA into your organization, and then if you needed access to the CDE, you would have to MFA in again once you've gotten access to the network to do that. So a lot of older companies, if anyone's familiar with things like jump servers and stuff like that, that's how they used MFA within the organization, for example, to get there. This is kind of requiring it at this point, is anybody getting into access of for the CDE will need to do so through MFA.
Yeah,
so it's not just admins.
Yeah, it's just a common sense thing, right? I mean, we use an MFA in all walks of life, not just in this circumstance related to PCI, but in your personal life, banking and things. I mean, it makes good sense. They've done studies on this where statistically to compromise an account that utilizes MFA is far more challenging and difficult to do so. So, with the the influx and constant pressure from new threats, this is where a lot of these requirements are evolving and requiring more strict controls.
Right. So another change, and this is a day one requirement, is the PCI DSS folks want to see scoping docs, and not scoping docs by us, scoping docs by you guys. And by you guys, I mean the clients, any QSAs who are on and things like that. They want to see an annual scoping assessment so that when the QSA comes in, you should be able to identify the data flows, the diagrams, where account data is stored, and the scoping environment. And I actually have 2 slides on this because it's not only these identifying the data flows and where it's stored, but they also go into system components in the CDE, identifying segmentation controls, connections from third-party entities, and confirming all this is here. Now, the reason I think this is great is because if you look at all these bullets, pretty much all these bullets are required for a PCI ROC anyway. And a lot of the time what we do is we end up kind of designing them and building them as part of the ROC. Is saying, let's identify the data flow. Now this is saying, hey, we expect the organizations to have these and update them on a regular basis and go through the scoping and understand your environment and going through. I think the council saw that they leaned a little bit on the QSAs to kind of define the environment and go through once they got in there. And they're saying that's great, but if the QSAs are only in once a year, what happens to the environment, in 6 months when they've made all these changes?
Yeah.
So this was a big thing. Go ahead.
It is a big thing. And I think folks need to realize this PCI is not a point in time, event, right? The validation is, but we're looking back over the year and making sure controls are in place and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, you need to be doing these things every day throughout the year. Yeah, we'll come in once a year and validate, but you should be doing all of these.
And this also ties back to roles and responsibilities. If you are tasked with being responsible for PCI, somebody should have these roles and responsibilities assigned as the requirements that are at the, half the requirements of one is, do you have a data flow diagram? Can you identify your all the equipment that you need to, things like that. So they should already be part of those in there. One thing to note, we've talked a little bit about merchants versus service providers. And there was a requirement in 3.2.1 that still exists, is if you had to segment your network, segmentation testing had to take place twice a year for service providers, once a year for merchants. the thought being that, service providers are changing their environment on a regular basis, changing firewall rules, putting in new equipment, moving stuff around. So you need to test those controls a little bit more often. This is the same requirement. If you're a service provider, you're moving stuff around, you're changing controls all the time, and they want this documented every 6 months now, not just annually. So it's something important to, if you are a service provider and you're going for a rock, this isn't going to be one of the ones that is going to be not tested. This is something that's going to be required to go through and get forward. And again, like Jerry keeps saying, this is good practice. One of the things in terms of the organizations that we really stress with everybody is know your environment, know where your card stuff is, know where your important information is, know the data flows, understand all that, because it's going to make it easier for you to secure it and easier to manage it. So risk assessments, this is a future requirement. But there was one requirement back in the day, well, back in 3.2.1 or in 3.2.1 that said, have you done an annual risk assessment? And that was really the end of it. Didn't get into what you had to do, how you had to do it, anything else like that. They're really kind of enhancing this and bringing it much more, making it more formal. This particular set of controls is around any control that has flexibility over frequency. The one I always use is if you have POS devices, how often do you do the tamper checks? In 3.2.1, it said periodically. Well, if I'm a convenience store, I'm doing a tamper check. I'm recommending you do a tamper check every day, because you can slip a skimmer on at the front of the convenience store and that'll be it. So you want to check that every day. However, if I am, and I'll use a college, if I'm a college office and I'm taking in one payment a month at a athletic organization, or 2 payments a month, and I have a POS device and I lock it in a file cabinet when it's not in use, the chances of it being tampered with are few and far between. You may do quarterly, you may do monthly, but what they're saying is you have to determine what the frequency is for anything that has a periodic or anything that is flexible. You have to do a risk assessment. You have to identify what the asset is, what the threat is, and why you made your decision. Using the example that I gave, I would probably, we can help with that as well. Don't think that you have to do this on your own. And this is something that Jerry and I always stress. If we work with you as QSAs, we can give you guidance. We can give you best practices. We can just talk through it with you if you want. And that's very, very important. And basically you want to do the targeted risk analysis at least once every 12 months to see what changes you've made and everything else that goes through that sort of stuff. But these are things that were kind of under the radar and understood that they'd like you to do. PCI is now formalizing it.
Yeah, they enhanced it. They did a great job enhancing it. Right, Derek? I mean, you look at what they did before, like you mentioned, they listed risk assessment. And that was it. They walked away. They finally completed the requirement. This is really the completion of it. They left it out there. It was vague. Here, you've got clarity. You know exactly what's required. And I promise you, this is going to be a problem for a lot of folks if you don't get ahead of it and begin preparing for this.
Yep. And then the last one out of the top 5, and please, this is not every change. This is me reading through it 2 or 3 times and pulling out what we considered, big changes. This is what I think is probably one of the top technical changes to this, is that internal vulnerability scans must be authenticated. It is a future requirement. For those of you who don't know the difference is we use Compass uses Qualys. A lot of you use Nessus. Some of you use Rapid7. There are hundreds of different ways to do a vulnerability scan. In most cases, if you just do what's called a default scan, it's going to look at all the devices in your environment and report back vulnerabilities on what it can find. A authenticated scan, and sometimes you'll hear this as a credentialed scan, means that you are giving it pretty much administration rights or administrator rights to be able to do a deep dive into that and find vulnerabilities and things that a top level scan may not be able to find. And so this puts in a couple of areas. One, PCI is really, really nervous about admin credentials as a fault. So these are things that are going to have to really be protected. The other thing is that network devices need to have a credentialed scan as well as endpoints. And I haven't done these scans in a while. I haven't been hands to the keyboard myself in a while, but it was really hard pulling off some of these network scans as credentials because they don't like people remotely trying to access them automatically that way. What I will say, however, is one of the reasons that I actually like this is many of you have started figuring out, since you now are working remotely and not always in the office, that any of the top scanners, Qualys and Nessus, and I mentioned Rapid, they all have agents now that are a little tiny agent that gets installed on the laptop or the PC or the server or whatever it is, and it reports back up to the scan environment. Because it's sitting on the PC with the rights, that's considered a credentialed scan. And so you're getting, many people are already getting this information back and meeting at least the endpoints. The reason I call this out, network devices as well as endpoints, is they haven't come up with clients to install on the network devices. They might soon. It would be terrific if they did. But right now, the network devices, switches, routers, firewalls, load balancers, still need to be scanned manually. And so if they're doing that, you need to talk to your IT folks or talk to us or talk to whoever and set up what's called a credentialed or authenticated scan, which means we need to manage those admin rights and do things like, if you're doing quarterly scanning, maybe turn off the rights until the scan is taking place and then turn them off. So this is going to be something that is an absolute technical change going forward. And we're going to be looking not only at the scan results to make sure you've done the scans, but looking at the setup for the scans to make sure that they're credentialed. And then with just a little under 10 minutes to go, some final thoughts on here. Again, the first final thought is, please, this is not everything. We're just starting this process. There's going to be more, I'm sure, once the QSA training goes forward. You're going to get another webinar about all of this and more. As we do deeper dives, you're going to see more blogs and more information. For assessors, all the stuff is, all the controls are there, all the guidance is there, everything is there. Start looking at stuff. For clients, for companies and things like that, I'd start with the change doc. Look at the stuff that they're combining, look at the new requirements, looking for things like that, and go through and see if anything is what I call a deal breaker for you today. And see where you want to, start going for that. Your QSAs are your friend. You hire your QSAs not only to provide the rock, hopefully if they're good ones, they will give you guidance. It doesn't have to be once a year sort of thing. Jerry and I talk to our clients on an annual, on a regular basis with questions, concerns, changes to setups, all those things. Reach out and say, what's my exposure here? What do you recommend going forward? Things like that. I pull a bullet in. If your rock is starting in the next 6 months, more than likely you're using 3-2-1. On the older ones, when we went 2-3 and even 3-3-1 and 3-3-2, Jerry and I said, hey, first weekend, we can do this. We'll start using the new format and make it work and start using best practices. You can't do that right now. If somebody tells you we're using the 4.0 framework, they're lying to you because they haven't been trained on it. You will see, if you go to the PCI website after the training comes out, you'll see that someone has been authenticated to provide 4.0 ROC assessments. Until that time, everybody's using 3-2-1, but it's time to study the 4.0 ROC. And then finally, one of the major areas that has not been released yet is many of you who don't do a full ROC do what's called self-assessment questionnaires or SAQs. We haven't received A, B, C, D, P to PE, so I don't know what the changes will be at this time. The controls are set in stone, but usually with these major releases, they move some of the controls around. The last time they added controls to A and C and did some stuff like that. So I can almost guarantee there will be changes. I don't know which new controls are going to filter into which SAQs. We will do, Jerry and I more than likely will absolutely do a blog, but we'll probably do another webinar when the SAQs are released. So that's to be determined and more to come. So those are, I'll stop there. I'll let Jerry, any final thoughts, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Yeah, and just sort of building on what Derek had said here, and also with what I led off with on one of the earlier slides was basically, your QSA, it's a partnership. If you're doing it right, it's a partnership, and that's a good thing. They're there. We are there for you, right, to provide guidance, to clarify the guidance that PCI provided, but also to help you in your specific, unique environment to understand how those control requirements map to your world, what you may need to do to be compliant and things like that. So start early. It's not just that one and done validation. It's that ongoing maintaining controls and that two-way conversation with your QSA company. It is gold. We do it for our clients anyway. Going forward, when new releases like this come out, we're going to work with each and every client leading into it. Even if they have no intention of trying to roll the controls out yet, we're going to highly encourage that. And Derek's right. We're going to be doing a lot more by way of blogs, perhaps white papers as well, to help our clients. And hopefully, if you have any questions, please reach out and we'll be glad to answer those for you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, guys. I'm going to hit you with a few questions right now. And the first one's actually for me. Any chance we'll be getting the recording and presentation deck? So the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, which you can find in the chat. That will be uploaded in the next day or two. And the slide deck I can send to you if you want to directly message me in Zoom with your email address. I can send you the slide deck. I also provide that to ISAC in New England, so you can ask them as well. But I don't have an email list generated from this Zoom call, so I'm not able to send it out to everybody automatically. So if you want the slide deck, you can either ask ISAC in New England, or you can ping me right now directly with your email, and I can get that to you.
And Nick, just for that, I added 2 slides over what you had, one on MFA and these final thoughts one. So I'll send this to you right after the call. Perfect. And you can just give that out to everybody.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question is for you guys. Are there cases where states have other requirements that add on or go beyond the PCI industry standards?
So I'll tell you this.
Yeah, go ahead, Jared.
No, I was just going to say, we've dealt with clients that way back in the beginning of, dealing with PCI since version 1.0. I've been doing it since it started, and we've seen a number of changes. But one of the things, like some countries, for example, won't allow background checks, right? We take it as commonplace here in the United States to perform background checks on employees, and it's part of the PCI requirement. Well, overseas in countries like Italy, it is you're not allowed to do that. So they we had to make a provision for that. And there was a few countries are like that they wouldn't let you do the full background. So imagine if a state had a specific requirement there. There may be a difference. I haven't seen that yet. I will say this is an international standard though, right? This is one standard for the world.
And Jerry's right. That was, in fact, that was one of the reasons they came up with the compensating control several years ago, is if there's a legal reason why you cannot adhere to a certain control, we can document the reason and go through and work with you to kind of design that sort of stuff. But Jerry's right. In most cases, I haven't seen a state that has stopped that from a requirement standpoint. PCI really tends to be a stand by itself certification, but if they will allow legal or business reasons, they just have to go through the process of analyzing the control and analyzing what the restriction is and saying, okay, how do we move forward going forward? So I say, if you come up with anything that you might think is a deal breaker, talk to a QSA.
Perfect. Thank you. I'd like to remind everyone too, if you have any questions, now's the time to post them. I have another question for you guys. If an organization does not reach higher levels of transactions, is it simpler for that organization to source out their payment card functions?
So I see, I loved when they came out with the point-to-point encryption standard, because it certainly was simpler to from a requirement standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, to be able to you only have to be assessed to 20 controls instead of 200. The smaller organizations, things like that, we see them going with third parties and farming out as much as they possibly can, or going online and basically what your level of compliance is based on not only transactions, but how you set up your organization. That's why there are so many different levels of SAQs. If you do online only payments and you farmed everything out, you may qualify for a lower level SAQ like an A. If you don't store any data and you don't have any processing in-house, you could qualify for an SAQC. There are levels, several million transactions for Visa and MasterCard that would require you to do a ROC. At the end of the day, it is your acquirer, normally your bank that has allowed you to take cards, that will tell you what version of PCI you need to adhere to. But we can help you and advise you. And I usually don't see the banks saying no or changing them unless you've been breached.
Yeah, and we get brought into a number of situations, as you can imagine. We've been doing this since the beginning of PCI, and honestly, consult with us, right? Ask us questions, and as you're developing your environment, where a question comes up, should I outsource this? Should I do that? We will provide you some good reasons why it makes sense potentially for your business, or maybe why it doesn't in some cases for other businesses, right? When you're looking at everything, considering the bottom line, the risks, the threats, how you're going to do the processing and things like that. But certainly outsourcing can be a great way. There's just no black and white answers. Unfortunately, everybody's environment's quite unique.
Perfect. I have two more questions queued up here. First one is, how can I find out if my QSA is PCI 4.0 certified since no training has been offered yet? Is there a portal where I can check this?
Yes,
I believe that. Yeah,
there is. And it'll be on the PC. It's on if you go to the PCI website, PCI DSS, and look under assessors, it's not ready yet, quite honestly. So the answer right now is no, nobody can. Like I said, I think they're targeting June for the training. So I'd expect to see the notifications coming out in July. Right now, they just tell you whether an assessor or company is compliant. Their goal is to say that they're not only compliant, but 4.0 trained as well. So, but you won't see that for another 3 months.
Yeah, it's funny because my annual requirement comes up in the end of May, so I'm going to have to test then, and then I'm going to retest again on 4.0. But yeah, it's good. I mean, it's good that they put the assessors through the rigorous training. But one other note too, I don't want to lose sight of it. It reminds me, based on this question, when you go to the PCI Security Standards website, all these documents are available or will be available, right? So you can download the template, you can look at the guidance, you can download the AOCs, the self-assessment questionnaires eventually. So all those things have always been out there traditionally. They still will be. And this is that's where you want to go for all things PCI, along with, hey, pick up the phone, call Compass. We'll talk with you about where you can get these things. We'll answer your questions along the way.
Perfect. Another question for you. Do financial institutions that offer credit cards to their customers and use a third-party service provider have to complete a PCI DSS assessment? And is it also dependent on the number of transactions?
Jerry, this is all, I know how much you love banks. So
I do. Both of us came from the banking environment 100 years ago, it feels like. But anyway, the answer is yeah. If you read every revision of PCI since 1.0, it's any party that stores, transmits, or processes payment card information, and anywhere, anything connected to that cardholder data environment, and now also anywhere since 3.2 and 3.2.1, anywhere, any aspect of your environment that is responsible for the security of that cardholder data environment is in scope. So based on the definition I just gave you, financial institutions, it's credit cards, debit cards, and stored value cards that, when they are processed, go through and clear, seek authorization, and come back. That transaction falls under PCI and needs to be they need to be PCI compliant. The validation of that, I'm doing it for. Compass does it for some financial institutions right now. So yeah, the answer is yes, they are required. Now, this begs the next question: why the heck don't we get pinged much, right? Why is that financial institution not getting pinged by their acquiring bank? If they haven't, as a merchant, if they haven't been, if they didn't validate or prove that they've been compliant. And the only thing I can say there is that they go for the higher risk individuals, which makes sense, right? The higher risk areas, which are the large providers, where as a bank, you are governed by the FFIEC in the United States for banking, so FDIC for banks, NCUA for credit unions, and there's a few other federal organizations that have a hand in it. And I assure you, having come from there, you have gone through the ringer when you are examined by the federal examiners, and so therefore, once they're done with you, the risk is definitely a lot more reasonable and lower. And I think that's why there's not as much pressure for financial institutions. But by the letter of PCI, you must be PCI compliant. Restore, transmit, or process.